Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday to you. Welcome to the next version of the Viridian Cannabis Expert Series. We've been holding these consistently throughout the year, interviewing CEOs of what we believe are the best positioned cannabis companies throughout the globe. We've been fortunate to have the CEO of Juicy Holdings, Tilt, Planet 13. Tomorrow we're interviewing Green Rose, one of the leading cannabis SPACs. And today we have Khiron Life Sciences Corp, one of the world's leading international medical cannabis companies and really a pioneer in being the first such medical cannabis company to stand up operations in Colombia and Peru, and now having moved into the European markets, UK and Germany. We have with us Alvaro Torres, who is the CEO and director of the company. Alvaro, welcome.
Good afternoon, Scott. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, great to be with you. We had the pleasure of finally meeting at the Benzinga Cannabis Conference in New York, I guess a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
But we've been watching your company for some years and watching the evolution of the Latin American marketplace, which was kind of you and the Canadian LPs that dove into that market some years ago. And you've clearly established a head start and a market leadership position in that market. Always helps to be on the ground and to be focused on that market, unlike some of your competition, which is kind of focused everywhere and all over the world. It makes a difference. And you announced just a couple of weeks ago your third quarter results. Congratulations on those. You had record revenues, 5 consecutive quarters of revenue growth, record sales of your medical cannabis products, record sales in your European business. I mean, it was really quite an astounding quarter, and I think representative of a lot of hard work, I'm sure. But I think equally the beginnings of the maturing, the evolution of the Latin American and European cannabis markets, which have been quite slow relative to the evolution and growth of the US marketplace. And as you're starting to post the results that you are and starting to give some real forward visibility and confidence and predictability in revenue growth, which is the key to being a public company, we're also starting to see it in terms of the capital markets, Alvaro, as you know. Mm-hmm. There has been a significant increase just this year in the amount of capital that's being invested in the Latin American and European cannabis market and the amount of M&A acquisition activity. I'm actually going to bring up, and this is going to be the only slide, folks, that we show. I want this really to be a discussion between myself and Alvaro. But guys, I'm going to share my screen now and bring up just the one chart that we're going to show. These are the equity raises and debt raises for European and Latin American cannabis companies last year and this year, and also M&A transactions. The numbers are very clear. The equity and debt investments in Latin American and European last year, there were only 8 of them, and they raised about $60 million. Pretty low levels of transactional activity. That's changed this year. We've had a doubling of the amount of investment activity in the Latin American and European markets, and we've had more than a doubling of the amount of capital invested. So 60 million last year, about 122 million this year. So still very much bubbling up. Not quite the levels we see in the US, where there's been about $6 billion of invested capital this year. But the biggest change we've seen globally year over year has been in Latin America and Europe. And it's not just on the investment side, it's also on the M&A side. So investors starting to look at Khiron and Chiron's regions, and now acquirers coming in. So last year, there were 8 M&A transactions of less than $100 million in total transaction value. This year, there were 50% more transactions, 12. And look at the transaction value. It's nearly 7 billion. Now, to be fair, a lot of that was the GW Jazz merger that comprised a lot of that number. But nonetheless, we're seeing a significant and continuous uptick in investors starting to point their eyes and their pocketbook at the Latin American and European marketplace. I'm going to stop sharing now and go back to the conversation. So you're well positioned, Alvaro. We're going to get into how and why. I'm going to start off by reading the forward-looking statements paragraph. Please note the following caution respecting forward-looking statements, which is made on behalf of Khiron Life Sciences and its reps on the call. These statements made on this call will contain forward-looking information that involves risks and uncertainties, including those introduced by COVID-19. Actual results could differ materially from a conclusion, forecast, or projection in the forward-looking information. Certain material factors or assumptions were applied in drawing a conclusion or making a forecast or projection as reflected in any forward-looking statements. Additional information about material factors that could cause actual results to differ materially from forecasts or projections are reflected in the forward-looking information that are contained in Khiron's filings with the Canadian provincial security regulators, which are available on the CEDAR website, which is cedar.com. So with that out of the way, Alvaro, you've built one of the world's leading international medical cannabis companies. You were first in Colombia and Peru. You're now throughout the European marketplace. You're a very patient-focused, data-focused organization. How did you do that? And what in your background, and I know you shared with me your father's background as well, gave you the confidence, the courage, the ability to execute what you've built today with Khiron?
Wow, Scott, that's a very good question. I would say, I'm an engineer by trade, and it's all about building strong foundations and being able to look at the future and know that even though it may take some time to build what you want to build, what you want to build is something sustainable. And for me, the sustainability of cannabis worldwide is that it's a big disruptor against the traditional pharma. And if we can think about cannabis that way, as long as it may take for regulations, for countries, for all of this access to happen, that is what I looked at when we decided to found this company. And when you're doing this type of projects, you rely on a team of people who know more than you about every aspect of the business. I'm in engineering, so I don't know much about regulation. I didn't know much about sales, about pharma. But I think for us and the company when we started there's two ways to look at this market. One is a supply chain issue, like selling coffee at $1.20 a pound. The other one is there's a big shift that is happening worldwide with traditional pharma. Medical cannabis can be a big disruptor in that industry, but we have to go after the patients. We have to go after the demand. We got to build that demand so it becomes sustainable. And at the same time, we're going to be building a unique position for the company. And I think that background of being able to think about things very systematically, that helped a lot. And then you're just trying to get a group of people from Europe, from Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Mexico, that understand that we are actually doing this to improve the quality of life of people. Absolutely. And I know this sounds a little bit subjective, but all of us will suffer through pain. And I don't want to live in a world where there's no options rather than taking opiates, which we all know it's been terrible. And that conversation, as subjective as it can be, is a very powerful message for everybody that works at the company. We will all be patients of medical cannabis 20, 30 years from now. Why not create a company that's going to be focused on building that and creating good products and opening up that market? And I think now the way I look at it and our team, we've broken so much ground and then that ground is going to reap great rewards. But sometimes you just got to be, Scott, you have to build the foundations and build the mud and all of these things. One day, very soon, we'll put the cladding on the building and it's going to be all looking very nice. But it started 4 years ago. So I'm very proud of everything our team has done. And I don't think I could have done anything without them, or I will ever do anything without everybody that works at Khiron and the patients. Really, in the end, companies can live and die like by capital, by shareholders. But if you don't have customers, you don't have patients, you don't have consumers, that's really what's going to kill this type of industry. And we have them. And every day we keep adding more. And that's really exciting.
Well, it comes across very clear in other interviews you've given, in your company marketing information, your website, your Q3 conference call. You are a patient-focused, data-focused organization. And when you say that in 5 or 10 or 20 years, everybody's going to be looking at medical cannabis as an alternative to opiates, I think that's happening today.
Yes.
As you know, Alvaro, we were very fortunate, Viridian was, a few years ago to represent and fund Israel's leading medical cannabis company. Mm-hmm. And they're doing clinical trials and they're very patient-focused. And when we were doing our research to represent that company, this was in 2018. We looked at all of the prescriptions of opiates in the US that year, of which there were about $60 billion worth of prescriptions that were written by a doctor, fulfilled by a patient, and reimbursed by an insurance company. $65 billion worth. Do you know what the 4 primary conditions were that people were resorting to taking these very addictive and dangerous drugs? It's everything that cannabis has been known to be useful for. Maybe we don't have the clinical trials yet, but to be useful for chronic pain, eating disorders, sleeping disorders, and anxiety. Those 4 conditions, chronic pain, sleeping, eating disorders, and anxiety, are what the cannabis plant has been known to help with for thousands of years. And I'm not being promotional in that. You look back at the Chinese, the Greeks, they were writing prescriptions, in their version for medical cannabis to treat these disease states. And yet, because it's not federally legal here, because we haven't had clinical trials, the plant, a natural botanical solution, is here, but people are still resorting to opiates for these conditions because we haven't gone through the science. So I'd like you to dig in more to your science, your data, your interactions with your patients, and how you're slowly evolving them to understand that there is an alternative, and the alternative is medical cannabis.
Well, Scott, I think back to the point you were making, one of the things that, let's say, for the last 100 years, we have accustomed doctors to reading about is medical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And the big challenge of cannabis is that we don't have that yet. But I do believe that doctors really are persuaded by 2 types of evidence. One is that type of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 evidence, which takes hundreds of millions of dollars to prove that something that everybody knows works. And the other is the real world evidence of a doctor seeing a patient, collecting that information, and be able to make a judgment about whether it works or not. And considering where we are in the cannabis industry, that's what we said about 3 years ago. If we can figure out a way to create a demand, to build an ecosystem of clinics and patients and data and evidence that are building every day that real world evidence, that's what's going to drive doctors and governments, Scott. Because, because of these things that we do, we got the Colombian government to cover medical cannabis. Yeah. That's how we're going to be able to grow that demand. Yeah. And one day, once we start capturing all this information and giving it to the doctors and showing them how much it works, what is it good for, what it's not good for, what are the side effects, and all of that controlled, that's how we can bring up more demand. And then start to look at the phase 1, 2, 3, 4 type of trials. I think, the lack of real world evidence, even in cannabis, because doctors don't have the ability to do this, has been also a handicap for the cannabis industry, particularly Latin America, let's call it Europe, or particularly in the UK. But the fact that we build this infrastructure, this ecosystem of clinics, where every day we have more patients coming in, more doctors prescribing because they see that working and they see that real world evidence, and you have a really good product, pharma grade behind it. That is something that we thought 3 years ago, if we don't do this, there's not going to be a market.
Yep.
And if we don't think about access, there's not going to be a market. Because one of the things with opiates and cannabis today is because of what you just said, makes also that opiates are free and cannabis is not. And when you have that, a product that hurts, that makes so much that creates so much damage, but it's free, versus a product that is not creating that many problems, but it's expensive and out of pocket, that is, I think, what we wanted to tackle. And so when we got into this clinic business and we started developing all this information, and we got more and more patients. I mean, we started selling in April last year in Colombia, first company ever. And I remember then we had 85 prescriptions in the first month of April. And today we do 100 prescriptions every 2 hours. And so that is because of this real world evidence, which then we showed to the government of Colombia, for instance. And we got them to accept medical cannabis as an insured product. And that's disruptive.
That's huge.
Now what we have to do is take this all across the rest of the countries, because we can show it works. And we can show the doctors that there's real world evidence to do that. But somebody's got to take that step. And I guess in our case, it was us who decided, let's do this, because otherwise, it doesn't matter how much you cultivate, there's not going to be any demand for it.
And one of the most important metrics of any business, and what you achieved in Q3 and reported on, was the amount of repeat customers, the level of retention that you have. I don't care whatever you're selling. I don't care if you're e-commerce or brick and mortar. The margins, the profitability is in the repeat customer. You don't have that customer acquisition cost of new customer. The repeat customers shows the model works, the product works, and you have a happy repeat customer. Can you talk about the increasing level, not only of new customers, which you have, but in retention and repeat business that you're now showing?
Well, I think as you just said, any business that wants to be profitable and sustainable in the medium or long term has got to have repeat customers. And that repeat customers for us is a matter of one or two variables. One, of course, is the quality of the product, whether it works or not. The second is access. How do you constantly make it easier and more accessible to the patients, that they can enjoy and they can look at the type of products that we're selling that are better than the alternatives they've been taking. Every day from day one, we set up systems in the company that measure on a daily basis how many return customers are we having, how many patients, new ones are we getting, why are they leaving, what are those causes, how do we fix that in a monthly basis. And the fact that we're able to gather all this information and all this data is getting us to the point where we know not only that we have a higher retention rate today than we had, of course, when we started, but also that the average ticket price, by that I mean the average number of units or monthly expenditure of the patient, goes from $50 back a year ago per patient to somewhere around $80 today. So not only are these patients returning, but because it's working, they are spending a lot more because we work so much on getting them the access with insurance coverage. And so now, what we have to always look at is, how do we make sure that the patients keep returning because they like the product, because we make it more accessible. And sometimes, so we do things, in Colombia, for instance, or how do we do home delivery? How do we go that extra mile so that we can make it easier for the patients to access the medication that works? And because of that obsession on access, not only in Colombia, but in the UK and in Germany, how do we make sure the patients get it covered? In Peru, how do we open as many dispensaries as possible so it's always easier for the patient to get away from this opiate business into cannabis? That's how we measure. I mean, today, the month of November, we just closed in November. Mostly I would say 68% of the patients are returning patients, and the average monthly ticket goes from 1 unit a month to 1.6. And because we're able to measure this all the time, that's how we can tweak our strategies daily basis. And we do this in Colombia, in Peru. We're doing this in the UK, where we just open a clinic, because it's all about making sure that patient stays with us. And the more that happens, and the more retention you get in any business, as you just said, the more sustainable your revenues are, your profits. And it's always cheaper to retain a customer than to acquire a new one, because those retained patients also bring you a lot of new patients to the clinics, because they talk about it, because we have Instagrams talking about real life stories. And I think, we're still very early stages of what we can accomplish in terms of retention, in terms of access. But I think the fact that we were able to focus so much on it from the core of the company, that is why we're seeing the results. And going back to what you said before, the record quarter is why I say to the team here, we're going to have record quarters every quarter because of that ability to retain patients.
You're also creating a brand.
Mm-hmm.
You're quite unique as an organization. 2015, 16, 17, Alvaro, we saw, and this was particularly true of the Canadian LPs, because they're serving a very small market. Canada's 30 million people. It's the size of California. They really had to look internationally, and they did. And they became too diverse, too disparate, too distracted. And in fact, over the last couple of years, you've started to see them shrink their international exposure, because you really have to do one thing really well to become a leader. And that's what you focused on. But you've taken an approach to be kind of a vertically integrated player. I'm not talking seed to sale.
Yeah.
I'm talking cultivation, production, brands, so you own your brands, providing medical clinics so you can really advise and educate patients. That's the key, educating patients. And you have your own products and your own brands. And now you've started to scale internationally. That's not easy. How did you do that? And I know you're not done. This is not a baked story. This is an evolving story. But what was the mission, the vision to create this vertically integrated operation that ultimately is serving your patients, giving the right medicine to your patients, and keep them coming back? What was the vision behind that?
Well, Scott, I think when we founded the company with my partners and with everybody that joined us, we wrote a mission of the company, which still lives today, which is we're here to improve the quality of life of people through the applied use of cannabis. When you think about improving the quality of life, it's not just about health-wise, it's about everything that surrounds the quality of life around your conditions. And this is why we focus so much on access. And when we wrote what are the principles of the company, which, in the end, that's really what matters, there were two things that were very important to us. One is that we always have to exceed the expectations of the patient. And that's sort of a culture guideline that is always going to be very hard to achieve. Yep. Because expectations are always higher. And the more you accomplish them, the higher they get, which also tells you about a lot about the culture of the company, because we can never sit idle saying we've done it, because that's never going to happen. The second thing is that complacency is not a place that has no place in our company, which means that any accomplishment we do is minimal compared to the accomplishments we're going to be doing later. So when we focus on access, and you think about access and you think about patients, you're saying, well, as we said to the company, this is not about selling a product. This is about providing access to that patient. The product can be sold backwards, Scott. I mean, now there's a lot of suppliers, GMP certifications, but what a brand really does is connect with that patient's or that person's needs. So why do we open a clinic in the UK? Because we need to provide more access to patients so that they can get doctors who are trained with it and get their medication they need. Of course, after that comes, a lot of sales, a lot of product, a lot of profits. But the focus on access from the very beginning, 4 years ago, when we wrote these principles and this mission, let everybody else try to sell cannabis or weed or marijuana, however they want to call it. We're here to sell healthcare. We're gonna here to improve the quality of life. And I think that is an obsession that we have as a company, which is why we think all the time, how do we do the home delivery? How do we use telehealth? How do we work with the patients, caretakers, so that they can have programs, so that they can support themselves? Because that obsession is what builds a brand. And today we're in very early stages, Scott, but I think that we're doing for the last 3 years is what people are going to write and talk about in 3 years from now when they say, how did they build this?
There's no question. And as this industry evolves into a consumer products industry, a branded industry, which it is and which it will, and we believe, I'm sure you agree, this will become the largest, if not one of the largest consumer branded industries in the world, surpassing alcohol and beer and entertainment and radio and movie and alcohol and spirits. And I mean, that's where we're evolving to. It's not what it was 5 years ago. It was all money was pouring into who builds the largest grow, how many lights do you have, excuse me, and what's your yield per plant. Nobody walks into a liquor store to buy their Grey Goose and asks, oh, where does that company grow its potatoes? Nobody cares. There's an attachment to the brand. So your early leadership, not just in Peru and Colombia where you were first, but now into Brazil, into the UK, Germany, eventually Mexico, you're creating an attachment to the brand. That is, in a world where there really are no national or international brands, that's of critical value. And the other point you make about access, I don't think is appreciated enough, Alvaro. And you could take California as an example. Largest single cannabis market in the world, estimated 6 to 7 billion a year. Went recreationally legal in November of 16, launched in January of 18. California has the lowest ratio of dispensaries to population out of any region in the world. What does that do? It supports the black market.
Yeah.
People need to buy their products, whether they're using it recreationally or medically or nutraceutically. And if they don't have easy access to your clinics and your dispensaries, they're going to go buy it in the black market. That's what's happening in California, and it's crushing the regulated market. So the reason I asked you about your approach of being vertically integrated is because I wanted you to focus on your intent on providing access and education, because I think that is really the crux of what's driving your growth, if I could say so. And I think it's a differentiated approach versus other companies. So I kind of wanted to acknowledge your vision and now your execution on access and education. It's obviously working. Let's spend a few minutes before we get into the financial picture of Khiron, talking about your evolution from Colombia and Peru, where you were the pioneer, to now into the European market, UK and Germany. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about how it's working so far? There's probably more competition in those European markets. How are you attacking the UK and Germany to drive a leadership position?
Well, Scott, I told you before when we first met, I went to school in the United States, my engineering, my master's, my MBA. I've always had, as a company, a global vision. As much as I'm Colombian, we love our country. This is a global industry. And what we need to learn is what do we take from one region to the next and be able to leverage all that expertise. So we've never built this company to be a Colombian-based company. The fact that I'm here and I live here is just coincidental, I think. But 5 years from now, I think this company will be truly global. And I think Europe is going to be a huge part of that. When we start looking at Germany and everybody starts to ask us, why would a Colombian-based company get into Germany if you cannot export flower from Colombia? He said, well, because what we're going to be exporting is the evidence and the education and the data that we have to convince doctors. You were just talking about that example, but if you think about things like yogurt and you think about companies like Yoplait or Danone, they don't need to own the cows to be able to own the market. I was lucky enough to meet a really good team that had a lot of expertise in Europe. We were discussing 2 years ago, how do we lead this market? And as much as people think that Germany is growing and it's still very small, it has a lot of opportunities. But what we can bring is first an understanding of what the demand is looking for in terms of product mix. Second, it's the education to the doctors based on real world evidence. And third, because we are not going to focus so much on what we can grow, because that would be limiting ourselves. If we understand what the demand wants, if we understand what the doctors are going to prescribe, then we can work backwards and start finding the right suppliers and be very agile at moving between different types of product mixes. And that's the case in Germany. And in the UK, we found ourselves in a position where we could be first mover entrants with this Project 2021 and registry and education of doctors. And I think it's all really based about evidence and education and data. And it's crazy to think sometimes that Colombian company is not, or based from Colombia, is not exporting anything but data. Yeah. But in the end, the world where we live today is not what it was 50 years ago. And the cannabis as a product, that as an API, will eventually be a commodity. And I want to be in the business with our team of having more access and being able to think about what the patients want. And of course, from a more economic perspective, as much as Latin America is big, we cannot be close-minded enough to know that there are risks associated with LATAM, always political and geographical. And our ability to be able to be in other markets that are, let's call it first world and with less risk politically, currency-wise, that also is going to offer investors in the long term an ability to, let's call it, hedge all of that global risk. And that's why we decided to go into Europe. And as long as it took us to do this, and I think it did take us a long time, because what I'm saying to you, and this is not easy to do. I think last quarter, people start looking at, wow, the amount of revenues we're getting out of Europe, the profitability we're getting out of Europe, and the mix that we're having. I think Europe will be, as a region, probably at the same level as Latin America combined, even with Mexico in the next 2 years. And I think then will people and investors will understand that there's now going to be a cross system and ecosystem that we're going to build of evidence from Europe, Germany, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico. Imagine all of that information on medical cannabis and who can really provide that data to doctors to keep building that market. That's sort of the way we look at it. I'm very happy and very proud that our team in Europe has been able to execute. And this is just really, really early stages. I mean, we started in Germany in March, and we already have 1% of the German market in 3 months of the flower market without having to touch the flower. So, there's something that we're doing right, and we are very early stages. I think it's going to keep growing very rapidly.
Data and information, ultimately empirical information from clinical trials, is the missing ingredient to evolve the medical cannabis market. People have been kind of using medical cannabis for sleep, for anxiety, for pain, to chill out, for inflammation in their knees for many, many, many years. But it's been kind of figuring out on their own. It's been kind of anecdotal. And the missing link to kind of capture that 65 billion in prescriptions of opiates for medical ailments that the cannabis plant has been solving for decades, centuries, it's in the data. Mm-hmm. So your approach, I believe, is a correct one. It also builds tremendous intellectual property for the company.
Yes.
And as a guy that's worked in the public markets for 30 years, particularly in an industry that has a medical component to it, a healthcare component to it, and a brand component to it, having that intellectual property has a value beyond just the financial performance of the company. Yes. So I believe in the approach that you're taking, and ultimately, as I say, it's good. It is what will ultimately enable the medical market probably to be the largest driver of revenues in the cannabis market. It's not going to be weed or vapes or the infused iced tea. It's going to be data supporting the medicinal use of the plant And so you're building up a very valuable database there.
Thank you, Scott.
So let's move on to what public market investors in this industry are looking for. So you have leadership, have a first mover advantage, you are providing access, you have repeat customers. What does it all mean to revenue growth and visible revenue growth? What does it all mean to be able to maintain and increase your margins? And what does it ultimately mean to being able to produce consistent cash flow? How does all of this vision and execution across multiple countries translate into sustainable, predictable growth, revenue and earnings?
Well, Scott, I think in the end, it's called imperfect markets. We're all looking to invest in companies that have a future. We're valuing companies in the future of those revenues. It's easy to sell $1 million a quarter at a loss. But what's hard to do is to do that consistently because the operational metrics work in markets that are as disruptive as cannabis is going to be. I think we look at Khiron today and you see 5 consecutive quarters with 85% gross profits. I think it's gonna get everybody looking at, well, 2 years from now, a year from now, when this company is doing $25, $30 million and upwards and onwards, the opportunity for a company like Khiron to be able to execute at that level with that gross profitability, which is really what's going to drive value, because you don't get to that cash flow positivity and net profits if you are not able to sell a product at a good margin. And how are you able to do that? Because you think about the value. Sometimes it takes a little longer, and as cannabis is very complex industry. But what I think we've tried to show to investors and to shareholders is that this is just the first inning of the first game of the World Series. And we have the right tools to be able to make this into a multi-million-dollar type of company, because the metrics that we measure, which are, basically speaking, patient acquisition, patient conversion, patient retention, and increase of monthly expenditure per patient are all happening every day. But in the end, of course, when we try to value these opportunities, we have to think about, first, is there a market for it? Of course, there is a market. If medical cannabis is going to be a disruptor for this opioid industry, for sure. Second, does this company have the right strategy? And even with all these things, in the middle of COVID, Scott, because we've been able to do this in the worst of conditions. And is it unique? Yes, it's unique, because it's all about thinking about the access, and that access is going to provide us with a lot of brand loyalty, and that loyalty is going to be. I would say to you that the brand loyalty we've been building today is more valuable than the current value of the company today, because that's what's going to drive the growth for the next 10 years.
I think, in fact, Alvaro, in your third quarter earnings call, I believe you made a statement that by the end of this year, which is all of 2 weeks away, the amount of medical cannabis that you will have productized and sold, not grown, sold to the consumer, branded Khiron, will be 10 times what you sold in 2020.
Yes.
That's pretty astounding.
Yes. And I think we are, very early, starting very early. Today, our major revenue growth today, let's call it, is Colombia and Germany. We started in Germany in March, Scott. And Colombia, which is a very big country, that's what's building the route for Brazil and Mexico. So that growth that we'll be able to show this year, 10 times revenues with the same profitability or higher, above 85%, that's not going to change anytime soon, because I think we built a mold around the company that's going to take many other companies a long time to try to figure out. Yep. And it's all about the culture of the company. And that is very difficult to replicate, because there's no real recipe for it, except focusing on that access. And that access is going to bring us a lot more revenue growth.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. So first of all, thank you, Alvaro. We all of these Viridian CEO Expert Series webinars we've done have been with US focused companies. and there have been leaders in the US marketplace. This is the first one we've done. And we had a choice of several dozen companies that would have liked to have had us interview them as we're doing with you, that are in the international marketplace, both in Latin America and Europe. But I'm not sure there was one that is as well positioned as you, that has early market leadership as you've developed, that is scaling across countries as you are. That is not easy. And that is showing the financial metrics of sustainable, predictable growth. So having said all that, you've got 15 million on the balance sheet. So in your conclusionary statement, Alvaro, how are you spending that money, and how are you solidifying, taking this template that you've built in Colombia and then Peru and now the UK and Germany and Mexico and Brazil? You have some capital in the bank. How are you spending that to scale and solidify and cement your first mover advantages in these markets?
Well, Scott, as I said before, it all goes back to the same things. What do we invest our capital on is increasing access. How do we increase access? Make sure we can have clinics and different types of formats. In Colombia, we're building 2 new clinics in the outskirts of Bogota, so we can be as close to that patient, so patients don't have to go and cross 1.5 hours across town to go to our clinics here. That's going to be very important because that opens a lot more access populations and neighborhoods of more than 1 million people. We're building a clinic in the UK. We just acquired a license for a clinic a license in the UK, and we're just building a clinic in Brazil. And this is because the more patients we can gather in that funnel that we've been talking about, the more long-term revenues and lifetime value of that patient we can acquire. And then secondly, is how do we analyze that data? And the more we have to think about systems and processes and medical records and security of that, because of course that's going to be very important, because that is going to drive a lot more ability for us to convert new patients, to retain them, and to increase the monthly expenditure. That is what we really focus on when we are looking about capital allocation, is to build ourselves more defenses, more walls, more clinics that in different types of formats that can allow us to capture a lot more demand. And I think that investment that we've done, we've proven. I mean, if you look backwards, Scott, if we hadn't acquired these clinics that we did 3 years ago, we wouldn't be talking today. We'd be another company trying to sell cheap cannabis, because how else could we have done it? So we know that we have a model that works. We know that a doctor in our clinics can prescribe 20 times as much as any external doctor. And our ability to go as close to the patient with more clinics, different formats, with more systems, with more call centers, so that we can focus on accessing those patients. That's really what's going to drive that growth. And the fact that we are able to show the sales and the profits every month, that means that every month, every quarter, we keep selling more, we keep having more returning patients, we keep enjoying good profitability, and these investments will pay for themselves. 2 years from now, when we have that dominant position in these 6 markets, UK, Germany, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, which is our goal for next year. Be happy that we made these investments in this access.
Alvaro, thank you. It's a very fundamentally strong story, which I always like. The company trades on the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Venture Exchange, symbol is KHRN, trades over the counter on the Senior Exchange, the QX, KHCNF. It also trades on the Frankfurt Exchange. This video interview will be available on Khiron's website, on the Viridian website, and will be distributed. Alvaro, really enjoyed it. Good to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's always a pleasure. Have a great day, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.